The echo of footsteps filled the marble corridors of Rome's imperial palace. Torches flickered against walls lined with gold, their flames trembling like they too feared the name whispered in every chamber, Caligula. The sound of soldiers chanting Ave Caesar rolled like thunder through the vast hallways, but beyond the grand display of power, there was an unsettling stillness, a silence heavy enough to crush a man's breath. And in that silence, a single truth pulsed beneath the empire's glittering skin in Rome. One word from the emperor could raise a man to the heavens or erase him from history. Within these gilded halls, the narrator's voice lowers. Where loyalty was bought with blood and laughter was as dangerous as treason, there lived a name that made even time shudder, Caligula. Once celebrated as the child of destiny, the beacon of renewal after the grim reign of Tiberius Caligula had been the empire's promise of light. Crowds once screamed his name with devotion. Poets called him the dawn after the storm. But within a few short years, that light twisted into something darker, a reign soaked in fear, desire, and madness. What draws a man from hope to horror? Where does power end and monstrosity begin? These are not just stories of cruelty, they are mirrors. And tonight we look into one of history's darkest reflections. This is the story of 5 acts so infamous they came to define an emperor. 5 moments when love, power, and fear collided until the line between man and God sanity and insanity vanished completely. So keep your ears open and your mind steady, for what you're about to hear may challenge everything you thought you knew about Rome's golden empire. The first sin, the forbidden bond music, swells soft strings under the distant hum of a banquet. Golden goblets clink, laughter echoes, and the scent of wine drifts through the grand dining hall. Statues of Venus, goddess of love, stand beneath the torchlight, their marble eyes watching as power and passion blur into one. At the center of it all sits Caligula, young, striking eyes burning with both brilliance and something no one dares name. Beside him is Julia Drusilla, his sister, radiant and calm, the only soul who could still the storm within him. To the empire, she was a princess. To Caligula, she was everything the world had denied him. Trust, affection, a fragment of purity in a court built on betrayal. Whispers ripple through the banquet hall. Some say he looked at her not as a brother should. Others call her his secret empress, the Shadow Queen, who shared not just his table but his throne. No chronicler dares write the truth. The scrolls speak in metaphors. They dined together as Jupiter and Juno. Whether those words were admiration or accusation, history never agreed. But one thing is certain, Caligula's heart belonged to Drusilla in ways that defied reason. When the Senate questioned her influence, he silenced them with a smile so cold it froze the air. He granted her the honors of a goddess while she yet lived. To him, she was the divine half of his soul. Beneath the layers of madness, there was a man terrified of losing the only person who saw him as more than a ruler. The boy who had watched his family murdered now clung to the one who remained. And when fear mixes with power, devotion becomes obsession. Then came the day Rome fell silent. Drusilla was dead. Fever, they said, but to Caligula it was betrayal by the gods themselves. The empire waited for their ruler's command. Instead, they saw a man unraveling before their eyes. Caligula locked himself away for days, refusing to eat or speak. When he emerged, his voice carried not grief, but divinity. "She is not gone," he declared. "She has ascended." He ordered the Senate to worship her as Diva Drusilla, the goddess reborn. Statues of her were raised across the city. Temples lit eternal flames in her name. For weeks, laughter was forbidden. Celebration was a crime. Even the breeze that carried joy was said to offend him. Those who served at court whispered that at night he wandered the palace, calling her name as if expecting her to return through the marble doors. In his eyes, she had not died. She had become the bridge between him and the divine. And if she was a goddess, then he by blood must be more than mortal. The bond that began as love ended as revelation, a twisted kind of immortality. From that moment, the empire no longer had a ruler made of flesh and reason. It had a god born of grief, desire, and loneliness. And in Caligula's eyes, love and divinity would never again be separate. The palace had gone cold. After Drusilla's death, something inside Caligula broke, or perhaps something darker was finally set free. The man who once wept for a lost sister now laughed in the face of mercy. The Palatine Palace glowed that evening like a temple built for madness. Torches burned high against crimson drapes, golden trays overflowed with grapes and wine, and music floated through the marble corridors. Nobles from across the empire had gathered, their smiles painted on their hearts, trembling beneath their robes. They came because refusing an invitation from the emperor was unthinkable. But every noble in that hall knew when Caligula smiled, someone else would suffer. At the head of the banquet he sat draped in white silk, a wreath of gold resting on his dark hair. His eyes were alive with mischief, the kind that made even laughter sound like a threat. "Tonight," he said softly, lifting his cup, "we shall celebrate the loyalty of Rome's finest." A murmur of nervous agreement filled the air. The nobles raised their goblets, exchanging glances that betrayed their fear. Then, with a single snap of his fingers, Caligula commanded silence. He called the name of a senator, proud, gray-haired, known for his virtue. "Bring him forward," Caligula said. The senator obeyed, trembling. The emperor's gaze shifted to the man's wife, seated nearby, her eyes lowered in terror. "Tell me," Caligula whispered loud enough for all to hear, "do you love your husband?" The hall went still. She nodded quickly, her voice lost in fear. "Good," Caligula said, smiling. "Then let us see if loyalty still holds when witnessed by Rome's God." He rose from his seat and stepped toward her. The music stopped. The air thickened. No one dared move. Caligula's shadow fell across her face as he reached out, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek, a gesture more cruel than tender. The senator's hands shook his lips, forming words he could not speak. Caligula's laughter sliced through the tension. "Ah, senator," he said mockingly, "does it wound your pride? You serve Rome, yet Rome serves me." He returned to his throne and raised his cup again. The guests forced smiles, the room echoing with hollow laughter. Some looked away, others stared at the floor, praying not to be chosen next. He continued calling names one after another, men of influence, soldiers of honor, each forced to witness the emperor's games. He asked questions not to be answered, gave orders meant only to humiliate. Every command dripped with contempt, each word designed to remind them that he held their dignity like a coin between his fingers and could crush it at will. The wine flowed, but no one drank. The food gleamed under candlelight untouched. The only true sound was the emperor's laughter, sharp, joyous, and empty. To Caligula, it was not about lust, it was about power. The pleasure he sought was not in desire, but in domination. Watching Rome's most respected men tremble fed the illusion that he was untouchable, not mortal, but divine. At one point, a young noble tried to make a toast to lighten the mood. Caligula fixed his gaze on him, a slow, deliberate stare that stretched into an eternity. Then with a smirk he said, "Speak if you dare, but remember, even your words belong to me." The man's voice cracked. The hall erupted in forced applause. Caligula smiled again, not with joy, but with hunger. He was testing how far fear could bend before it broke. Hours passed. The feast turned to farce. The candles burned low, melting into pools of wax as nobles slipped into despair. They were trapped in a theater where the only actor who mattered was Caligula himself. At last he stood. "Rome," he declared, "is built not on stone or sword, but on obedience." His voice rose, echoing off the marble walls. "And obedience," he said, his grin widening, "is sweetest when it comes from those who once thought themselves powerful." He turned his back and left the hall, his footsteps steady, deliberate, the sound of a man convinced of his own divinity. Behind him the nobles exhaled, as if surfacing from deep water. Some cried silently. Others simply stared into their goblets, seeing not wine but the reflection of their own humiliation. The narrator's voice returns low and heavy. He did not crave flesh. He craved the shudder in a man's breath, the silence before submission. To Caligula, fear was the truest form of devotion. The music fades into a slow, ominous drumbeat. When power becomes entertainment, the voice continues, a man no longer knows whether he stands upon a throne or the edge of an abyss. The laughter from the nobles' banquet still lingered in the marble halls, but it was no longer laughter born of joy. It was the echo of fear pretending to sound alive. And Caligula, now fully intoxicated by the taste of power, sought new ways to feed the emptiness inside him. Night fell over Rome like a velvet curtain, soft yet suffocating. The moon floated above the domes of the Palatine Palace, bathing the empire's heart in pale light. From the distance came the faint hum of lyres and the rhythm of drums like a heartbeat pulsing through the veins of the city. Inside the palace, the emperor was awake. He had ordered a feast unlike any before, one that would, in his words, make the gods envy Rome. Golden candelabras flickered across the walls, their flames bending to the rhythm of the lyre. Servants rushed about, faces pale, afraid to look too long at what they were preparing for. When Caligula entered the hall, erupted in cheers too loud to be sincere. He was draped in a robe of crimson silk, a crown of jewels on his head, his eyes gleaming with a wild, feverish light. "Tonight," he said, "Rome will forget its chains. Tonight, even the gods will bow." The doors closed. The world outside ceased to exist. The music swelled and wine flowed like blood into golden cups. The scent of incense and sweat mixed into a dizzying haze. The emperor's laughter cut through the noise, deep, rhythmic, commanding. Around him, senators, courtiers, and guests played their parts in a theater where morality no longer existed. The narrator's voice softens, painting the scene. Without detail, only mood wine ran like blood. Laughter bled into screams. The palace became a place where demons were invited to dine. As the hours passed, the atmosphere grew thick, almost unreal. Torches burned low shadows, danced across the faces of Rome's elite, their eyes hollow, their smiles trembling. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Others tried to keep pace with the emperor's madness, knowing hesitation could cost their lives. At one corner of the hall, a young soldier stood guard, his armor gleaming in the candlelight. His gaze was fixed on the floor, but every sound made him flinch. He could not unsee what was before him, his emperor transforming revelry into ritual. It was not indulgence anymore, it was worship. Caligula moved through the crowd like a conductor of chaos. He called for musicians to play louder, for torches to burn brighter. "Why do you look so frightened?" he shouted. "Have you never seen joy before?" The laughter that followed was sharp, broken, a command disguised as mirth. The narrator continues, voice low and deliberate. He wasn't chasing pleasure, he was staging a performance. Every moment of excess, every trembling breath around him, reminded Caligula that he ruled not just Rome's laws, but its souls. The servants trembled as they poured more wine, their hands shaking so badly the liquid spilled across the marble floor. One dropped a tray and the crash of silver echoed like thunder. The room froze. Caligula turned slowly toward the sound. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he smiled. "Even the plates tremble before me," he said, waving his hand. Laughter erupted, forced, terrified, desperate to drown the silence. The servant collapsed in tears of relief, alive, only because his mistake had amused the emperor. The night wore on a blur of sound and motion. Outside, the moon dipped behind the clouds, hiding from the spectacle below. Inside, the air thickened with smoke and exhaustion. Even the marble seemed to sweat beneath the heat of it all. The narrator's tone darkens, power can twist desire into ceremony. For Caligula, these nights were no longer about indulgence. They were communion proof that he alone could unmake the rules of gods and men. Near dawn, when the candles had melted into puddles of wax, Caligula rose from his throne. His voice, hoarse but resolute, echoed through the room. "Remember this night," he said, "for Rome has never been so alive." No one dared answer. The guests knelt as he passed, their faces pale beneath the dying light. When the doors finally opened, the cool air of morning swept in, carrying with it the stench of smoke, wine, and something unholy. The soldiers watched silently as Caligula disappeared down the corridor, his robe trailing behind like a river of red. The narrator's voice lingers heavy with sorrow and awe. In that night's firelight, Caligula was no longer a man. He had become something else, not divine, not human, but power itself walking in mortal form. The echoes of Caligula's midnight feasts still haunted the palace, the laughter, the trembling, the fear that never slept. But beyond the marble walls, the empire itself began to feel the weight of its emperor's madness. The whispers that once stayed within Rome's courts now reached the barracks, the markets, the streets, and Caligula, sensing doubt, decided it was time to remind everyone, soldier or slave, that he was not merely ruler of Rome, but ruler of reality itself. The sun blazed high over the northern coast. A cold wind whipped across the shoreline as thousands of Roman soldiers stood in perfect rows, their armor gleaming beneath the light. Drums thundered, standards fluttered. To anyone watching from afar, it looked like the beginning of another glorious campaign. But the enemy they faced was not a rival army. It was the sea. Caligula appeared at the head of the formation, mounted on a white horse cloak snapping behind him. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the endless blue waves that stretched like a mirror of the heavens. "We stand before Neptune himself," he declared, raising his arm. "The god of the sea shall kneel before Rome." The generals exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared question him. The soldiers, confused, lifted their shields, waiting for orders that made sense. "Attack!" Caligula shouted. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then, as if gripped by invisible chains, the legions obeyed. Thousands of men charged into the surf swords, flashing shields, splashing the waves, crashing around their legs. Their shouts mingled with the roar of the ocean, a battle cry against nothing. When Caligula finally lowered his hand, the soldiers stood, gasping, drenched, staring at the sea that refused to bleed. The emperor's laughter broke the stillness. "Behold," he cried, "the sea retreats before your might." He ordered his men to collect seashells along the shore, spoils of war, he called them, gifts of the conquered god. The soldiers bent down their fingers, digging through wet sand, their armor clanking, their pride dissolving with every handful of shells. From his chariot, Caligula watched them with a grin that held no joy. "You will present these trophies to the Senate," he said. "Proof that I have conquered Neptune himself." The narrator's tone deepens, carrying both awe and sorrow. It wasn't madness alone that drove him. It was the hunger to make belief itself his weapon. To force men to kneel not before truth, but illusion. As the legions marched back to camp, their helmets weighed heavier than their shields. That night, around the fires, no one spoke of glory. They sat in silence, staring at the seashells piled before them, each one a symbol of their humiliation. One soldier, older than the rest, broke the silence. His voice was hoarse, the words barely above a whisper. "We don't know if we fight for Rome anymore," he said, "or for the madness of one man." The others said nothing. The crackling fire answered for them, sparks vanishing into the cold night. The story spread. From the soldiers' lips to the city's streets, from merchants to mothers, the tale of the battle against the sea became both legend and warning. Some laughed behind closed doors, others shivered at what it meant. Soon after, Caligula demanded temples be built in his honor. "Let Rome worship not her emperors," he said, "but her living gods." He dressed himself in armor of gold and commanded his soldiers to kneel before him as if before Jupiter himself. Some hesitated, most obeyed. The narrator's voice lowers the tone grave. Obedience had become the empire's last virtue. Rome was no longer ruled by reason or law, but by the terror of disbelief. Even among the people, fear replaced faith. Market stalls emptied at the sound of the emperor's approach. Citizens cheered with trembling hands, praying not to be noticed. The city of marble and order was turning into a stage for a single actor, and every soul within its walls had become his unwilling audience. As dawn broke over the shore, the waves rolled gently over the footprints of the Roman legions. The seashells glimmered beneath the water, washing away the memory of conquest. But for those who had lived it, the shame would never fade. The narrator's final words echo like a judgment. "Power without mercy leaves no victories, only survivors." In Caligula's Rome, the soldiers who once carried eagles on their standards now carried the weight of their own submission. And the man who commanded them had become not a leader, but a storm that devoured everything in its path. The drums fade, the sea returns to silence. By then, the narrator whispers, Rome had forgotten the difference between worship and fear. The sound of the sea faded into memory. The soldiers had marched home, their heads bowed beneath invisible chains. But within the marble walls of Rome's palace, the emperor who humiliated gods and men alike was no longer celebrating, he was listening. Drusilla, the name floated through the empty corridors, soft as dust. It was late. The moonlight spilled through the tall windows of the imperial chamber, painting the floor in silver streaks. Caligula sat alone, his robe of crimson and gold draped carelessly across his throne. The torches burned low, their flames shrinking as if afraid to breathe too loud. He turned his head sharply. "Who's there?" Only silence answered. For months the emperor had been haunted by whispers, by shadows, by the sound of his own heartbeat. He trusted no one. Every servant was a spy, every senator a traitor, every friend a ghost wearing another's face. Even his reflection in the polished marble made him recoil. At times he would laugh to himself. "They all fear me," he'd whisper. "That means they still believe." But even that laughter was hollow now. The narrator's tone deepens. The man who once demanded to be worshipped now trembled at the echo of his own divinity. For in crowning himself a god, Caligula had condemned himself to a loneliness only gods could understand. He began to wander the palace halls at night barefoot, muttering prayers to Drusilla, the sister he'd turned into a goddess. He swore she still spoke to him, guiding his hand, blessing his reign. Yet her voice, real or imagined, only deepened his madness. Rumors spread faster than the plague. The emperor no longer held court. He performed rituals. He spoke to statues, issued decrees to the moon, and ordered guards to strike at invisible enemies. And the palace, once filled with music, laughter, and terror, grew eerily quiet. People avoided his gaze. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, whispered among themselves. Their faces hardened into masks of duty, but behind them lay the glint of something dangerous desperation. Then came the morning of January 24th in the 41st year after Christ. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and incense. Caligula had summoned his court to the theater for a celebration, another display of his supposed divinity. He entered, surrounded by his guards, smiling faintly as if the world still bowed at his feet. But that night, as the crowds dispersed and the corridors emptied, he stayed behind with a handful of attendants. The echo of footsteps followed him down the hall, measured, deliberate, closer. The narrator's voice slows steady as a heartbeat. There are moments in history when silence becomes sharper than a blade, a faint rustle, a whisper too close, then a gasp. The sound of a sword sliding from its sheath cut through the air. Caligula turned eyes wide, not in rage this time, but recognition. The shadows he had created had finally found him. No scream came, only the clash of metal, the sharp rhythm of breathing, and then stillness. The narrator does not describe the violence. Instead, the imagery takes over. A crimson cloak fell to the marble floor, spreading like the sunset of an empire. The torches flickered once, twice, and went out. The city slept that night without celebration. When dawn came, the sun rose pale over Rome, quiet, indifferent. The man who had called himself a god lay still, his throne already cold, but his story did not die. Caligula, the narrator says softly, was not the first ruler consumed by power, nor the last. His crimes were not merely acts of cruelty, they were reflections of a truth humanity still refuses to face. Power unchecked does not elevate, it corrodes. It strips away humanity piece by piece until all that remains is hunger and the illusion that fear can replace love. The music shifts slow, strings mournful and reflective. Power without mercy, the voice continues, is not power at all. It's madness wearing a crown. The scene widens in scope, carrying the listener beyond ancient Rome. Empires rise and fall, names fade into dust, yet the pattern repeats. Whenever a man believes himself untouchable, whenever fear becomes his throne, the shadow of Caligula returns. The tone turns, almost pleading a whisper to the listener. When we begin to believe that control defines greatness, we forget what truly makes us human, and history, patient, merciless, reminds us again. The drums return slow and distant, like a heartbeat fading into eternity. The Roman Empire collapsed long ago, the narrator concludes, but the echo of its madness still walks among us. May we learn to stop before power takes what little of our soul remains. A pause. Then softly, the call to reflection. If you wish to journey deeper into the shadows of Rome, into the stories history dared not tell, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and stay with us. Because the past is never truly gone. It only waits for someone to listen.